All right, well, Christina, welcome to the Charles Aris Executive Exchange podcast. For those who might not recognize my voice or face, I'm Noah Schultz. I'm one of the practice leaders here at Charles Aris within our strategy and go-to-market practice. So I spend almost all of my time recruiting current and former strategy and management consultants, as well as commercial leaders in the go-to-market verticals, dedicated 100% to the life science industry. And thanks so much for hopping on. A conversation topic that comes up very often for us is consultants that we've either approached about opportunities or have reached out to us to think about what the next step in their career could potentially look like. And I know you have recently gone through a similar transition. So I would love to hear a little bit about kind of your just career background and then also some of the milestones that have led you up to this point of recently making a career transition.
Yeah, it's a good question. I'll start from where I am now and where I started. So right now I lead corporate development at a company called Otsuka Precision Health, which is a health experience company. So we think about how do we use data and technology to better predict, prevent, and manage conditions for people of all stages of life. And before then, I was at McKinsey for about 7 years, which is a lot longer than what most people probably stay at for. So I started as a business analyst back in 2017 in Dallas and recently left as a senior engagement manager. I think it's been about 10 months or so. And at the firm, you do kind of your random walk. The first 2 years, I think I served about 8 different industries on different topics, and then eventually kind of found myself in a hub of healthcare and technology. And then as a background, I started as a pre-med double major with business, later got my master's in accounting. So I was always in that intersection of business and life sciences. And to this day, that's kind of the sphere that I'm in.
I had assumed there were some kind of either milestones or inflection points that really helped shape that career journey. Anything you would love to call out?
Yeah, for me, I'll go back to my time at McKinsey because it was such a big part of my career. One kind of defining milestone for me was definitely when I was trying to jump from the senior business analyst role into an engagement manager role. I think at the firm, people say that's kind of like the hardest jump to make, even when compared to maybe the associate jumping into an EM role. For me, it was more of this kind of like mindset shift that happened during that time period where, I grew up in a East Asian immigrant family, very traditional, and there wasn't this kind of like notion of self-advocacy, like advocating for what you want, why you want it. And, as I was kind of going through that promotion stage, that self-advocacy was something that I needed to do and to do that like intentionally. And, also in corporate America, you would probably agree with me, like hard work doesn't always translate into a, result. And so you've got to be the one that's advocating for yourself. So I had to kind of think about why do I deserve this promotion? And then getting the people to kind of sponsor with me and say, yeah, Christina deserves this promotion, almost creating like a little mini campaign of Christina Bay, let's make her into an EM kind of thing. But that experience has fundamentally changed how I think about not just my career growth, I would say, but my self growth more broadly.
Well, obviously, there's a lot of intention and effort that goes into building a successful career in arguably one of the top management consulting firms and just organizations as a whole in the world.
Hmm.
The decision to make the transition from what is very lucrative career into corporate America, leaving consulting, I assume there was a lot of thought that went into that. So I'd love to hear about your thought process and how that decision came about.
Yeah, there was a lot of thought into it. And I think I knew for a while that I wanted to leave consulting, but there were a couple things that were keeping me, right? One was, we call it the golden handcuff. Like life from a comp perspective, from prestige, it was pretty good. I think the stability that came with it as well. And the second thing is, I felt like I was still learning something new every day. So that got me to stay. But over time, for me, like I started feeling the toll both mentally and physically COVID was a weird time because we were working like, gosh, sometimes 90-hour weeks. And then post COVID became a different time because we're now worried about not getting enough client work. And so figuring out how do we all become hands on deck to get more leads in. And so at some point, I sort of had to ask the question for myself of like, do I stay and focus my career on solving problems from the outside? Or do I want to be inside and actually like leading something and executing on something? Because, and I think a lot of consultants talk about this too. You can spend hours and hours on an amazing deck with like the best recommendations, but like who knows what clients are going to do with that. And so I felt like at some point I've sort of had that urge to leave. Gosh, like being able to say, okay, I'm ready. It took a longer time than I'd imagined.
Right. We often, in talking with clients that leverage Charles Aris to find top tier consultants from the various organizations out there, that they put a high priority and premium on the consultant toolkit and skills that are developed in these organizations throughout your career.
Yeah.
What have been some of the valuable skills now that you have transitioned into corporate America that I would hope that resonates with you now, seeing both sides of the equation? Would love to hear what some of those skills are.
The first thing that comes to my mind was actually, it was like my first day at McKinsey. You get unsolicited advice from people. And one of the advice that I got was, always have a perspective and be ready to share it. And at that
Hmm.
time, I didn't quite know what that meant, but that kind of stuck with me throughout. It's basically this essence is, even if your initial take is not perfect, having a point of view helps because then other people can start building on it, refining it. You get to a better idea than what you started out with. And I think, especially in corporate settings, or just even in life too, when we're tasked with these really hard or complex, messy problems, being able to have a perspective, whether it's a good one or not, definitely, can be valuable. That's one. I think the second is I don't think I quite fully appreciated what it means to be a strong generalist. And that's something, right, you get at consulting. You may not build like an expertise on one very specific niche, but what you're doing is you are constantly changing projects. Like every 3 months, 6 months, you're on a new project, sometimes on a new industry. And so you kind of have to ramp up to new things fast and still be able to help the clients. I think there's a saying that like, McKinsey consultant, you may get dropped off in the middle of Iowa and have to solve like a big problem. And they would be able to do that because of the skills that, you learn at the firm. And so I do think that that's really true because, now that I'm kind of outside, I'm constantly navigating things that I've never had to think about or are ambiguous. And if you think about it, some of the best leaders and CEOs are great generalists themselves. And so I have a deeper appreciation, perhaps, for what that means.
Great. Was there anything that you've learned that you really weren't expecting from making the transition? I'm sure you put a lot of thought into what life would be like moving into corporate America, but I'd love to see what was unexpected.
There's a few. I think first and foremost, moving into corporate America, the pace, like I anticipated it to be different. And it's not just about like things are moving slower. It's just there is a much more like internal alignment and buy-in that you've got to get before you make something happen. I think in consulting and maybe for some startups too, like decisions happen very quickly and it's like bias to action, go and do that thing, right? But in some of these more like traditional corporate roles, you've got to bring your people along the way and like your thought process. And that may take some time. So that's one that I anticipated, but now that I'm experiencing more, it's like, "Oh, that's quite different." I think the second thing is like figuring out how to meaningfully spend time outside of work because, some days I'd be working 13, 14 hours in consulting. And now most of my evenings are pretty well protected. My weekends are well protected. And so I'm like, oh my goodness, what do I do with this time? And I'm a little bit of like a workaholic, I will admit, in that sense. I'm disciplined in like, okay, I'm working and now I'm just working. But now I'm like, how do I strike a balance, right? And spend time on things that I may not have before. I think that's the other thing. And then maybe the last thing, going back to the point around sharing your perspective. In consulting, like we're trained to have really strong opinions, right? Our clients, for the most part, appreciate when we have that. But I think in the corporate setting, what I learn is you're typically working with people who are 10, 15, 20 years into this field. And so instead of coming in hot with the take of, here's my perspective, being a little bit smart about like maybe turning that into a question that you ask, and thinking about how you influence people more effectively that way has been something that I'm still learning.
For more of the Charles Aris podcast and access to additional resources like compensation reports, blog articles, and newsletters, visit our resource hub at www.charlesaris.com/resource.
Appreciate that. That is great advice. And also, being in the industry as a consultant, it's interesting too that just the decision-making process can be completely different once you're on that side of the equation, being as opposed to being on the consulting side of the equation, even though it could be at the same client. So that perspective is very interesting. If there were pieces of advice that you have learned that you would pass along to consultants, that rewind 12 months, think about yourself when you were going through the process of exploring new opportunities, what advice would you give to consultants that you've learned?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think I talk to anywhere between 1 to 3 people every week who are thinking about leaving consulting or have already declared search and are looking. And my biggest piece of advice to, you know, the people I talk to is try to take that time to really reflect on like what it is that you want in your career and also in your life broadly. For me, leaving McKinsey, I realized that a big part of my like identity and sense of purpose, to be honest, was tied to my work. And so the process of leaving was like a lot scarier than it was. And I didn't quite realize, how much of kind of weight I put into what I do. But I think taking the time to like really reflect on myself, figuring out like what are the things that I want to try out in my life. And so during my search time, I actually thought about starting my own consulting business. And then I did my own market research, talking to potential clients, trying to kind of figure out a brand for my business and testing out different ideas. And I feel like, this this notion of like give your permission to experiment, right? Because it may be that the next role that you go into may not be conventional, and corporate world and the jobs that we have, they're only one of like many options. And so I think for me, that's probably the biggest advice is, really take the time to reflect and then try something. It could be completely different, right? It could be like entrepreneurship or something like a creative pursuit, but thinking about what I want and then also thinking about like what are the trade-offs that I'm willing to make, whether that's from a pay perspective, stability, job titles, etc., so that I can try something different. So,
Great. Well, I've got a couple of hot take questions for you. I think it's a very helpful exercise for individuals in similar transitions in their career to think through, just build a job for yourself, leveraging just a high level framework of what you would do for free, and then try to find a job that will actually pay you to do that. I think that can be incredibly helpful as a starting point. But if you were to give someone advice on crafting their own job description, what did you learn going through that process?
yeah, first and foremost, I love that idea. I think for me, I was surprised to learn that a lot of people who left consulting sort of crafted their own role.
Mm-hmm.
It's more common than I think people realize. And it could be like you're sitting in the room with, a CEO of a company you're excited about, and you guys like come up with a new role together that the company needs. And I've seen that happen, but I think more oftenly it's that there's a role that already exists, but you're actively shaping it to reflect kind of what you want to get out of it. That's been the case for me in my current role. So before I accepted my offer, I flew out to meet my now boss in Colorado, and over lunch, I shared, and I still have it on my wall, but like a scrappy career roadmap of this is where I am right now, and this is where I want to go. At some point, I want to be, able to lead an organization, and here are the kind of like the skill sets that I want to develop. And I think having that conversation was really helpful, because even if the current role that I'm in doesn't necessarily check the box on all of those fronts, it helped my manager and myself to sort of figure out, okay, where are like the opportunities or projects that we could do where I could get more of that, expertise. So I mentioned to him, like things that energizes me. I love leading projects, mentoring people, building something real, not just PowerPoint decks and Excel models. And while strategy is something that I will always build on, it's an expertise of mine. I also want to step into product development. And so now I'm actually in sort of that space of looking for ways that we can drive some of our innovation projects. And I'm learning the full arc of product development, from like user research to wireframing to building prototypes, proof of concept, all of that, which, as someone who is leading corporate development, you wouldn't traditionally think that that's in the job description, but, we were able to kind of create that opportunity together. And even now, my boss and I have a pretty active dialogue around, what I want to do next. And so I mentioned to him, like, comms and marketing is something that I've always had a lot of interest in. And so now we're looking for ways to integrate that into my work. And so I think it starts with kind of, you know, thinking about, what am I good at? What do I want to do more of? And then co-creating that path with someone who sees the potential in you.
Very cool. I have heard, but from multiple individuals throughout my career, that there's a notion that you can only leave fill in the blank consulting company once.
Yeah.
Personally, I think that might be a bit of a myth, but I'm curious your hot take on that statement.
Yeah, I mean, my hot take is I think it is a myth. um, I I know that many people who've thought about leaving consulting, right? Like it's scary. And I wonder if part of it is like kind of driven by this fear of like, oh my gosh, I need to make sure that I go into the right company with the right job title, etc. But the fact is, a lot of people who've left consulting actually went back to join after a few years. And often they come back with like fresher perspective and just like a greater appreciation for client services work. And so this idea that you get like one shot to leave, in my perspective, is a bit rooted in fear. And I do understand where people are coming from, right? Like, for the most part, being in a consulting firm, the path is very well defined for you. You know the start and you know the end of like where you should go. And so leaving consulting can feel like a bit of a risky move to make. But I do think it's like, at the end of the day, and I get reminded about this from my husband, who's a physician, is like, life is too short, right? Like life is too short to not take a risk, not take a little bit of a pay cut because you're more excited about the job, or it gives you more time to focus on your health, for instance. And so, because you just never know what tomorrow can bring, I think if there's like a risk that excites you, even if it's not very conventional to what your peers are jumping into, like take it. Because for the most part, I do think consulting will be there if you ever want to come back. It may look a little bit different now that, AI is in the mix, but it might be better than what you left it as, because you may have, not have to make as many PowerPoint pages and things like that.
So, Christina, you had mentioned earlier in the conversation how you have a somewhat better work-life balance as a result of making the transition into corporate America, and it's not constant 14-hour workdays. I'm curious how you have found uses for some of this new time, whether that's new interests or hobbies. Would love to hear what you're up to.
Yeah, it's a good question. So for me, I'm still kind of figuring out what balance means to me, but I definitely have more time, or more space, I would say, to think, to be creative, to work strategically. And so now I'm definitely focused on investing in my own health, like you are. And now that I've entered in my 30s, working out is not a nice to have. It's like my life depends on it. So I picked up tennis when I turned 30, and it is one of the hardest sports Also because I didn't grow up playing sports. I was in choir and I was in music. So I don't have like the fast twitch muscles I need to move really fast. But I've been really enjoying getting better at it, and I'm trying to be more disciplined. My goal this year is to play in tournaments because I live in San Diego. I feel like I should take, the advantage of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Has it allowed you, aside from any other additional hobbies or areas you've got to explore? I mean, tennis is a great sport to learn. I hear pickleball is catching on across the US, and that might be more my speed now that I've crossed the 40-year-old mark. But other pursuits or interests that you've now like been able to dive into?
Yeah, couple of things. One, I do career coaching on the side. So typically this is where I will work with professionals or undergrads, business school students on either jumping into consulting or leaving consulting. And it's been incredibly rewarding in being able to like work together on helping them find their clarity around what is it they want out of their career. In the last recruiting cycle, about 85% of my candidates that I worked with actually landed offers in one of the three MBB consulting firms. So I feel like I know a little bit of what I'm doing. But other than that, I think the other thing I'm focused on is just learning a bit more about personal finance and building wealth. Like I don't think I've quite had the time or the appreciation for it. But these days I've been reading, so right now I'm learning about real estate investing. And I think, like small businesses, and there's so many different topics. So I'm learning about that. And then lastly, I have a little Substack where I started out writing about sharing my burnout experiences, and kind of to your point around like holistic health, like burnouts happen when some aspect of your wellness, whether that's physical wellness or mental wellness or even your like spiritual wellness, when they kind of fall to the side. So I started by kind of writing my own experiences there. And I'm trying to be more consistent this year because I think there's so much power in storytelling and hearing from other people's experience. So I'm actually thinking about starting like a little mini podcast or a mini interview with people where we reflect on like, what would you tell your 20s? What would you have, told yourself in your 30s?
Very cool. Well, I appreciate you coming on with us today and talking through your experience. I know for a fact that there are countless individuals going through similar thought processes right now that will hear this and will absolutely get some value from the thoughts that you shared. So look forward to staying connected and supporting you in your career any way that we can here at the organization, and really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to chat with us.
Always appreciate our friendship, Noah. Thank you so much.